Greetings and welcome to my new venture. I am Shannon, a weaver of tales and fibers, and if you're new here, then you are entering a time of transition for me, as this podcast is evolving. If you are a returning listener, welcome back, and I hope you enjoy the new changes. To surmise, this podcast is transitioning to include a YouTube channel, Cottage Weaver of Fiber and Tales, where I weave a new fabric while weaving a tale of ghost stories and legends, and even a cryptid or two. So if you are someone who loves the spooky tales and love the fiber arts as well, then you can visit my YouTube channel, Cottage Weaver of Fiber and Tales. If, however, you are more interested in the spooky, then please feel free to continue listening to my tales via your preferred listening platform. Keep in mind, this is still a safe place for everyone and anyone. It is a place that values the green and mental ease. And with that being said, let's see how this goes. Now, to get started on this tale, I feel I must warn you, this is a true tale of one that includes death and abuse. If these are some things that might offend you, please do not listen. This is the story of the Bloody Benders. The Benders were a family of 4 who lived near the Osage Trail near Cherryvale, Kansas. During the 1870s, it was a rough time. It was before the Civil War, and one of the hot topics of the time was slavery. Kansas at the time considered itself a Union state, but in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was created. In essence, it created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, repealing the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and allowed the settlers to determine if they would allow slavery within their boundaries. So one neighbor could have slaves if they wanted, while the neighbor down the street could decide not to. This then led to many fights and skirmishes with deadly results. To combat those who were pro-slavery, the northern states decided to flood the Kansas and Nebraska territories with northern immigrants, known as free staters, to sort of overtake the states and increase the number of those against the act of slavery. With both groups competing for land, you can imagine the types of fights that occurred. Just after the Civil War, indigenous tribes were then forced out of southeastern Kansas, and this allowed for 5 spiritualist families to settle in. Enter the Benders. The Benders were one of these spiritualists. This family was made up of John Bender Sr., his wife Almira, a son John Jr., and a daughter Kate. They got to choose a prime spot of land totaling 160 acres right on the Osage Mission Independence Trail in Labette County, Kansas. The family built a small 1-room cabin, barn, corral, and a well. They also began a small garden and orchard. Soon after, a sign was hung advertising groceries, and they named their grocery store the Wayside Inn. They offered a few things, including powder, meals, and other basics like tobacco and liquor. But one other thing they offered was a safe overnight place to stay for those lowly travelers. This was the late 1870s, so when one went traveling, there would be little to no communications with families or friends. So it was quite a while till people started reporting missing family members. These were mostly male. And by 1873, 2 years after the Benders had opened up shop, rumors were running through the area of the dangers of traveling the Osage Trail, to the point where travelers began avoiding the trail completely. Real action did not take place till George Newton Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter, Mary Ann, left Independence, Kansas, to find a new life in Iowa. However, they disappeared along the trail, the Osage Trail. When he and his daughter were never heard from that spring, Dr. William Henry York, George's neighbor, went looking for him. William knew people in high places, and he was able to rally an investigation of all the neighboring farms and families, even stopping to talk and eat supper with the Benders. Communication with the Benders was spotty at best. John Sr. was known as being brash, rude, and very gnarly looking. He spoke very broken English, having immigrated from Germany or the Netherlands, and what words he could speak were mostly curse words. His wife, Almira, also spoke broken English, but it was a bit clearer. However, she was known for having a vile temper, and she was referred to by most as the Devil Woman. Their reported children, John Jr., spoke much better English and was described as someone who would laugh at anything, sometimes uncontrollably. And their daughter, Kate, a reported believer of free love, well, she was also a psychic and would offer her services as a soothsayer to the townsfolk, even offering a reading to help find the missing Dr. Longcore and his daughter. William York wasn't just anyone who happened to disappear. He had two brothers, Ed York, who lived in Fort Scott, and Colonel Alexander M. York, a Civil War veteran and lawyer and member of the Kansas State Senate. When Colonel York stopped at the Benders and asked about the missing people, including his brother, the Benders alleged that York had been there, but had left after a meal and some rest. The Benders went on to suggest that Indians had probably attacked and killed them. Although this was a possibility, Colonel York considered, he really wasn't convinced. In May of 1871, a man's body was discovered in Drum Creek. His throat was slashed and his skull had been crushed in. The body was identified as a man named Jones. It was suspected that the owner of Drum Creek was to blame, but no charges were brought against him. The following year, in February of 1872, two bodies were found with the same horrible wounds, throats slit and skulls bashed in. By 1873, reports of missing travelers had become so common that most tried to avoid the area. As history shows, when groups of people become scared, they look to hurriedly blame someone or something. This resulted in neighboring communities and towns to blame the entire Osage community for all the deaths. Under this threat, the people of Osage agreed to meet. There, they decided to obtain warrants and search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. This included the Benders' home. And just 3 days later, the Benders' neighbor, a Billy Toll, noticed the Benders' livestock were looking very malnourished. Billy reported this to a Leroy F. Dick, the township trustee. Once Leroy heard of this, he rounded up a group of men, which included Dr. York's brothers, Colonel York and Ed York. Once they arrived, they found that the Benders' horses and carriage were gone. As they entered the small cabin, they found it abandoned and virtually empty of all goods and personal items. No food, no clothing, just a few scattered remains, as well as a very pungent odor. As the men searched, they found a trap door had been nailed shut. When it was pried open, the full force of the stench hit these men, but all they found was dried and congealed blood in a space that measured 6 by 7 by 3 feet. The men probed and dug in that small hole under the cabin, but found no human remains. They then picked up and physically moved the cabin. There, they dug all around the area, but still found nothing. Deciding to expand their search, the men began digging in the garden and orchard. There, they found the body of Dr. York, as well as 9 other bodies. They believed they had found all the deceased and had stopped for the night. Sadly, the next day, 8 more bodies were found in the original 9 graves discovered the day before. Another body was found in the well, along with several body parts. The body of a young girl was also discovered. There were no injuries to her body, and it was believed that she had either been strangled or buried alive. Among the few remaining objects left at the Benders' house was a Bible with words written in German. These translated to Johanna Bender, born July 30th, 1848, John Gebert, came to America on July 1st. It says 18-something, but the last two numbers could not be determined. Written in the Bible is also Big Slaughter Day, January 8th, and finally, hell departed. There were also a number of bullet holes found in the cabin walls. It was later deduced by the news reporters that these were the desperate attempts of the Benders' victims in order to save their lives. Like I said earlier, history shows what mob mentality can do to people. Once word got out about the body count and what remained of the Benders' home was slowly destroyed by souvenir hunters who took anything they could. Bricks, stones from the wall, pieces of wood, essentially anything one could rip up and carry away. Reward money was offered in the amount of $1,000, which in today's currency would be $25,433 for the family's arrest. That amount was increased on May 17th by Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne to $2,000, which today would be roughly $50,867. Once the Bible was discovered, it was surmised that the Benders were not whom they claimed to be. The most plausible deduction is that John Bender Sr. may have been born John Flickinger and was either from Germany, Norway, or possibly the Netherlands. Most newspapers state that Almeria, or Elvira, was born Almira Hill Mark, sometimes reported as Meek, M-E-I-K. She was born in the Adirondack Mountains of Michigan. She married a man named Simon Mark, and she herself claimed to have 12 children. She later married a man named William Stephen Griffith. The rumor mill got to going and said she had murdered a number of husbands, but none of this was ever proven. However, it is believed that Kate was Elvira, aka Almira's, daughter, and it's believed that John Jr. is actually Kate's husband, as it was reported by many townsfolk that the two were seen acting more like a married couple than brother and sister. Based on what evidence was found, the belief is that the Benders would lure lowly and tired travelers into their store with the promise of supper and a place to rest. Some say Kate was the one who would woo many of the men inside. Whilst the men were eating their meal, John Sr. would be behind a cloth divider that separated the grocery store from the sleeping quarters. While the traveler was busy eating and listening to Kate go on about her psychic abilities or her feelings of free love, John Sr. would use some sort of tool, either a hammer or a sledgehammer, and smash the unsuspecting traveler on the head. Kate, or Elvira, would then slit the throat, and the body would be tossed down the trap door, where the man would bleed to death. This is how the stench came to rise and fill the small cabin, as all the blood from those bodies sank down deep into the soil. Anything of value would be stripped from the body, which would then be buried in the garden or orchard. Once their story spread, a few came forward with their own harrowing accounts, not realizing just how close to death they had become. A William Pickering said when he refused to sit near the cloth, the one separating the store from the living quarters, Kate had brandished a knife and threatened him, at which William fled the farm. And a Mrs. Fitz was sitting at the dinner table as well, and believed she heard a muffled sound from behind her, behind that curtain. She states Kate issued some sort of command, possibly in German, but before anything could happen, Mrs. Fitz also fled. And a Catholic priest, a Father Paul Ponzaglione, claimed that one of the Bender men had a hammer on his person. The father became uneasy, said he needed to go check on his horses, and hurriedly ran away. And then there is the story of two men who had stopped at the inn and reported that when they refused to eat at the table by the cloth, Kate became very abusive towards them. It was not documented just what she did, but the two men said that they both took off. The Benders' wagons and starved horses were eventually found outside the city limits of Thayer. About 12 miles north of their home, inquiries confirmed that the family purchased train tickets for Humboldt, Kansas, on the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad. At Chanute, John Jr. and Kate left that train and boarded the MK&T train south to the terminus near Denison, Texas. And from there they traveled to an outlaw colony near the Texas and New Mexico border. There the trail ended, as lawmen tended to disappear in that area. A detective later claimed that he kept following the trail and found that John Jr. had died of a hemorrhagic stroke. As for the elders, John Sr. and Elvira, well, these two stayed on the train, riding trains to St. Louis, Missouri. We have conflicting reports that John Bender, aka John Flickinger, committed suicide in Lake Michigan in 1884. However, that same year, a man matching his description was arrested in Montana for murdering a man by hitting him in the head with a hammer. The suspect was detained and was awaiting confirmation of his identity when he was found dead. He had been held by leg irons, and in an attempt to escape, the man severed his leg at the foot. He ended up bleeding to death, and by the time a deputy had arrived to identify the man, he had decomposed so badly that confirmation could not be obtained. Now, in an odd twist of fate, the skull of this man was displayed in a saloon until Prohibition caused the place to shut down. The skull, whether it was John Bender's or not, disappeared shortly after. As for Kate and Elmira, well, here is where it gets twisted. In 1889, October 31st, a Mrs. Elmira Monroe and a Mrs. Sarah Eliza Davis were arrested in Niles, Michigan for larceny. These two were found not guilty and released, only to be arrested a short time later and accused for the Bender murders. A Mrs. Frances E. McCann had accused them of being the Benders who had murdered her father. Apparently, she had been receiving dreams about her father's murder. One Osage Township witness confirmed their identity as Kate and Elmira. Now, Mrs. Davis said Mrs. Monroe was in fact the matriarch, Elmira Bender, but she was not Kate. She was in fact Kate's sister, Sarah. Then Mrs. Monroe countered, stating she was not Sarah, she was Kate. The two women were taken back to Oswego, Kansas, where 7 out of 3 members confirmed visually that the two were actually the Bender women. The case then takes another turn when a woman by the name of Mary Gardee claims that she is another of Elmira's daughters and that Elmira had been in prison in Detroit during these Bender murders. She claimed that Elmira had married a man with the last name Shearer, and prison records showed that there was a woman with the name Elmira Shearer who was incarcerated at the time of the Benders' rampage. A marriage certificate was also produced showing a someone named Elmira had married Mr. Shearer. However, eyewitnesses still claimed the women to be Kate and Elmira, but the judge chose to believe the documents, which, let's be honest, could have been forges, as well as the fact that they could have belonged to anyone. Sadly, those documents, the marriage certificate and affidavits, all disappeared from Labette County Courthouse. Something else to point out was that neither of the women reportedly spoke with any sort of foreign accent. The women left the courthouse and were never heard from again. Well, that was one hell of a story. They say the Benders are the first reported serial murders of the United States. Sadly, no one was ever brought to trial. It is estimated that the Benders lured and murdered 20 people. However, many remains were only found of partial body parts, so that number could be more. If you like this story and want to hear more, head on over to your favorite listening platform where you can listen to all of my spooky tales. And if you're looking for more than just an audio, head over to my YouTube channel, where you can hear me weave the tales of the benders, as well as watch me weave my latest creation. I'm not just a weaver of tales, but also of fabric. And don't forget to hit all those likes, shares, and subscription buttons too.